We're now calling this October 10th, 2024 meeting of the Rent Control Board to order. Can I please have a roll call?
Yes, Commissioner Ambrose. Here. Commissioner Foster.
Here.
Commissioner Ivanov.
Here.
Vice Chair Gonska.
Here.
Chair Leslie.
Here. Please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Can everyone please review the minutes from our last meeting, please?
I move to approve the minutes.
Second.
Okay. Can I have a roll call vote, please?
Yes, Commissioner Foster.
Yes.
Commissioner Ivanov.
Yes.
Commissioner Ambrose.
Yes.
Vice Chair Gonska.
Yes.
Chair Leslie.
Yes.
Motion carries.
Thank you. Now we will have our special agenda items.
Thank you, Chair. Good evening, Commissioners. John unfortunately could not be here tonight. He's still recovering, but I'm sure that he'll be back with us next month, and I know that everybody wishes him a speedy recovery. Just have a couple of announcements tonight. The first one is kind of a sad one. This is our beloved Secretary Alvin Ho's last meeting with the board. He has going off to greener pastures. He's accepted a promotion with the Public Works Department and is going to start there later this month. We all wish him well, and we just want to thank him so much for his service. He's just been an incredible asset to us here at the agency, and we will miss him greatly. The second announcement that I wanted to make, I just wanted to remind our landlord community that according to state law, there must be an allowed rental payment that is neither cash nor electronic funds transfer, and that if the landlord allows payment by check, you cannot charge a fee for that. So we just wanted to make that a reminder this evening. And finally, the third announcement I wanted to make, I'm going to ask Alvin to put up our little table. If I could point you to the screen. The board will recall that at the beginning of this year, we instituted a program to collect outstanding registration fees on delinquent properties. So we have started that program, and we have prioritized those properties that had 3 years' worth of outstanding registration fees, because our own statute of limitations prohibits us from going back farther than 3 years. So we wanted to at least go after those properties that were delinquent from 2021 before that deadline hit. So those are 44 properties with those types of unpaid bills. And so we were able to resolve 10 of those prior to filing suit, and you can see what we collected based on that. And then we filed 20 cases in small claims court, 14 cases in limited civil court. And the way we divided that up is the smaller properties with smaller amounts outstanding, we did in small claims court, and then the larger properties we did in limited civil court. And then we reached settlements in 12 of the small claims court cases and settlements in 5 of the limited civil cases, and you can see the totals that we collected there for a grand total so far of $78,417.70. So you can see that this program has been very, very successful. I want to thank our senior litigation attorney, Rebecca Sherman, who has spearheaded this project. And the way that this has worked is suing is the last resort. So she will send letters to the owners, she will call the owners personally, she will negotiate with as many owners as she can and contact them, and you can see how That's already been very successful, that approach. And then only when we've exhausted all of that will she then file cases in court. And so those are the hardest cases once they get to court. I also wanted to point out that of the small claims course cases that have gone to court, three of them have gone to trial, and we've gotten judgments in each of those. And you can see the amount of the judgments there. That's not part of our collected total because those judgments, we're going to have to go after those, and that's a whole separate process. I also want to thank information coordinators Karen Evans and Rose Patel. They have also been instrumental. They are the ones who are making our court appearances in the small claims actions. And so Rebecca has been working closely with them, and they've done a great job, as you can see from the judgments that we received. So I'll keep you updated as this program continues, but we are making this part of our regular process. Once we get through the 2021 cases, we'll move to 22, 23, and then once we get caught up, this will just be part of the regular process of collecting registration fees. Thank you. That's all I have.
Awesome. Thank you. Do we have any requests for public comment?
Oh, I've got a, Madam Chair.
I'm sorry? Oh, sure, Commissioner Foster.
I just wanted to say thank you to staff for that. That's amazing. Our ability to do what our wonderful staff does every single day is dependent upon our registration fees. So thank you for collecting all that. I just wanted to take a moment and say a huge thank you to our board secretary. The public may not know what you do, but we do. And, there's no greater help to all of us facilitating these meetings, working with City TV and working with the City of Santa Monica, with the facilities, with all of the records and the reports and the things that you do, to help to assist Jonathan and the managers and especially all of us in the board coordination. It's a tough job. It requires long hours, and we just really, we're going to miss you. It's been a while now, and so it's really going to be different, without you here. And I just wanted to say a huge thank you for everything you've brought to this board. Thank you so much. We'll miss you.
Okay. So next, we are going to move on to our jurisdictional items. Item 10A. Can I have a staff report, please?
Certainly, Commissioners. This is an owner occupancy exemption by Mr. Huang at 1814 18th Street. He's a sole property owner, and the property only contains 3 units, and he doesn't own any other residential property in LA County. So the question before you was whether he had provided sufficient evidence to show that he has lived at this property for at least 120 days prior to filing the application. He provided utility, financial, and government records, and the sole tenant on the property orally confirmed to us that he lives there, but that tenant did not return the tenant response form. So out of prudence and due diligence, we asked our investigator to go visit the site, and she submitted a report, and that report is also consistent with the fact that he lives there. And so staff is recommending that you grant that exemption application and adopt the proposed findings of fact and conclusions of law.
Any board comments? Okay. Commissioner Foster?
Yeah, this case is very straightforward. I move that we grant.
Second.
May we have a roll call vote, please?
Yes, Commissioner Ivanov,
Yes.
Commissioner Ambrose,
Yes.
Commissioner Foster,
Yes.
Vice Chair Gonska,
Yes.
Chair Leslie.
Yes.
Motion carries.
Moving on to item 10A2. May I please have a staff report, please?
Certainly, Commissioners. This one is an application by Ruth Fragoso, who's the owner of 1833 Euclid Street, which is a 3-unit property. She is the sole property owner. The question before you is, again, whether she's provided sufficient evidence to show that she's lived there for at least 120 days. She owns multiple other residential properties in Los Angeles County from places like Inglewood and Cudahy, and in Los Angeles itself, but she provided rental agreements for those properties. For herself, she also provided utility, financial, and government records to show that she lives here. The tenants on the property also confirmed that she lives there, and so staff is recommending that the board grant this exemption application and adopt the proposed findings of fact and conclusions of law.
Commissioner Ivanov.
This is virtually the same fact pattern from item 10A1, so I would move that we adopt the findings of fact and conclusions of law.
Second.
May we have a roll call vote, please?
Yes. Commissioner Ambrose,
Yes.
Commissioner Foster,
Yes.
Commissioner Ivanov,
Yes.
Vice Chair Gonska,
Yes.
Chair Leslie.
Yes,
Motion carries.
thank you. And once again, 10A3.
Commissioners, this is a single-family exemption. Actually, it's a condo, and it's filed by Eileen Cook, who's the owner of 937 18th Street, Unit 1. She owns this property with her husband and another couple. And this property was already a condo building before the enactment of the rent control law. So the question before you is whether she's provided sufficient evidence to show that she's lived on the property for at least 2 years as her principal residence. She herself doesn't own any other residential property in LA County, and she's provided utility, financial, and government records that support her claim. Staff again is recommending the board grant this exemption and adopt the proposed findings of fact and conclusions of law.
Commissioner, Vice Chair Gonska, please.
Just a couple of questions regarding the regulations. So if the owner satisfies the requirement to reside as a principal residence for at least 2 years, does that, and they're granted this exemption, does that exemption persist regardless of if the owner moves out after those 2 years?
That is correct. That's pursuant to Section 1815 of the Charter that grants permanent exemptions to single-family homes and condos that are eligible for this.
Okay, and then I know obviously this is different than an owner occupancy exemption, but I noticed obviously with those cases, we get reports from other tenants in the building or sometimes send an investigator out to verify that they live there. Is there any such part of this process?
No, because it's just a single-family home without a tenant. It's just a person living there. So there is not the same thing that would affect a tenant or that a third party that could verify like a tenant there. So it's different for that. So these cases we treat differently. This is part of the original amendment to the charter that tried to set up this kind of exemption for single-family homes and condos of this nature, and that's the procedure that we follow.
Okay, so we rely on basically the government records and other things that are submitted. Okay, thank you.
Commissioner Foster.
Thank you. So you noted the 25% ownership interest. Does this have any different impact than it does, say, with the 50+% required in other types of cases? I wondered why you made a note of it.
There is no actual percentage ownership requirement for single-family homes. It's just a different setup than those because it's a permanent exemption. It's focused on single-family homes and condos. So it really makes no dispositive difference that there is 25, 50, 10, all of those things. It's okay. So long as they're the owner and so long as they've lived there for 2 years.
And also, I would add to Commissioner Gonska's point, Costa-Hawkins automatically grants the ability to exempt single-family homes and condos, and it's often the case that we've had units that at some point had been used as a rental and were under rent control only for that probable reason. And so this is somebody, a subsequent owner coming along and realizing that they're getting mail from the Rent Control Board of Santa Monica, and they're wondering why, and then they call, and then they find out they can get an exemption. So sometimes we just see these trickle in occasionally. Maybe like once a year.
Yeah, and also, Commissioner, other units in this condo building already have received this. A lot of times they have done it through that other way of getting the exemption, which is a declaration that this property wasn't rented on July 1st, 1984. These people didn't have the knowledge of that, so they went the 2-year route, and that goes before you.
Commissioner Ambrose.
I think that the applicant has satisfied all the requirements, so I'm going to make a motion to grant the permanent exemption of the single-family home at 937 18th Street pursuant to Section 1815 of the Rent Control Law.
Second.
May we please have a roll call vote, please?
Yes. Commissioner Foster,
Yes.
Commissioner Ivanov,
Yes.
Commissioner Ambrose,
Yes.
Vice Chair Gronska,
Yes.
Chair Leslie.
Yes.
Motion carries.
Okay, now on to 10B1. May I please have a staff report?
Commissioners, Carissa Danchuk, apologies if I mispronounce, is the tenant of Unit A, filed a rent decrease petition for loss of her garage amenity. Her landlord, Mr. Hernandez, had notified her that she had to vacate her garage space in anticipation of an ADU construction on the property. The permits had yet to be issued. Her unit was a studio with a MAR of 1165. The hearing officer granted her a decrease of $135 in accordance with the board's regulations. The owner, Mr. Hernandez, has appealed the decision, and he argues that the state and city ADU laws do not require replacement of parking for construction of an ADU. And as detailed in the staff report, the city's building code does not require replacement of parking in order to construct an ADU. However, neither the state nor the city ADU laws exempt the property from the rent control law. And under the rent control law, a tenant who loses an amenity such as parking is entitled to a rent decrease under Board Regulation 4200 to avoid the kind of backdoor rent increase where the rent stays the same but your amenities are reduced. Mr. Hernandez is not required by this decision to replace the lost amenity, but so long as it has been eliminated, Ms. Danchuk is entitled to a rent decrease, and therefore staff recommends that the board affirm the decision and its findings of fact and conclusions of law.
No. Any commissioners have any discussion? Okay. I don't think we have any speakers on this one. I'm sorry, Commissioner Foster.
Thank you. Yeah, this case was very clear. There's no grounds for an appeal. There was no error that I can find of any way, shape, or form, and it seems to be a simple misunderstanding on the part of the owner as to how this works. This is a basket of goods that was contracted for, and it's within our jurisdiction and power to reduce the rent for a reduction in that basket of goods, the content of said basket, because they are no longer receiving the same value that they contracted for under the law. So to me, this is very clear, and I move to deny the appeal.
Second.
Okay, may we have a roll call vote, please?
Yes, Commissioner Foster,
Yes.
Commissioner Ivanov,
Yes.
Commissioner Ambrose,
Yes.
Vice Chair Gronska,
Yes.
Chair Leslie.
Yes.
Motion carries.
Now we're on to 10B2. May I please have a staff report?
Commissioners, Kyle Garibaldi, who's a tenant of Unit A at 2248 20th Street, filed a rent decrease petition for an inoperative wall heater. His unit is a one-bedroom with a MAR of $2,807 prior to the decision, and the hearing officer granted a decrease of $175, and Mr. Garibaldi has appealed the decision. He argues that the hearing officer should have granted him a higher decrease because of the amount of time he and his family spent out of the unit because of the inoperative heater. Now, the board reviews this matter as an appellate body, therefore it should affirm the decision if it is supported by substantial evidence, even if the board might have found differently had it been finder of fact. The board's regulations provide for a range of $15 to $220 for inoperative heaters. The decrease granted should be proportional to the amount of the impairment in relation to the totality of housing services that are paid for by the rent, and also proportional to the rent. And here, Mr. Garibaldi's rent is slightly higher than the average MAR for a unit of this size in the city area. The hearing officer granted a decrease of $175 on the higher end of the range, and she did so, she said, because the heater was inoperative and also to be in proportion to the totality of services paid for by the rent and the rent itself. Substantial evidence supports her finding, which is in accordance with the board's regulation, and staff therefore recommends the board affirm the decision and its findings of fact and conclusions of law.
Thank you. Vice Chair Gonska.
So I have a question about this is kind of unique to the timing of this case, but I noticed that that the hearing was held and the record was closed January 31st of this year. And just a little over a week later, on I believe the 8th of February, we passed changes to the decrease standard ranges. And so I'm just curious how that's being applied to these cases, because in particular for the heater, what's cited in the report is the decrease amounts of $15 to $220. And the new range is $18 to $286. So one, just sort of how are we looking at timing to apply that? Because while the hearing was held, the petition was filed, the hearing was held, the record was closed. Before that change, the record was reopened in July of this year, and the hearing officer decision was signed on August 1st after those changes had occurred. So one, just how is that being applied? And then two, would that potentially impact the hearing officer's decision here in terms of that amount that was granted?
I can address that. So if you'll recall, when we passed those valuation changes, I think it was Commissioner Gwynn who asked that very same question, and we made it clear then that petitions that were already in the pipeline, already in the hopper, would not be subject to the new valuations. They would only be applied to petitions that were filed after the valuations were passed. So the old valuations are what applies to this particular case.
So it's really looking at when they're filed, the petitions are filed. Okay.
Right.
And then this is a sort of a broader question, but on the same topic, it's sort of like, trying to understand how proportionality is calculated. Because in the reports that we get, we don't really, there's no seemingly formula or a really in-depth explanation where the hearing officer is telling us, other than just saying that the amounts granted is proportional to the rent amount, which is obviously required for this process. But how do we determine what's actually proportional? Is there any sort of, what I'm looking for is to see if there's a sort of consistent and standard application of that word proportionality.
Right. Well, what we have from the hearing officer is that when we talked about the proportionality of the rent, that's one of the reasons that I mentioned that, because the hearing officer mentioned it, that the rent here is slightly higher than the average. And we are also dealing with a heater situation, which was completely inoperative. So the hearing officer went to the higher end of the range that you had from 15 to 225, and then given the where the rent falls in terms of the averages, that was one of the factors that was used into coming up with this specific amount. Also, as I mentioned, has to be proportional to the totality of the housing services, and that includes everything from roof, bedroom, bathroom, kitchen, parking, whatever there is. All of those things are paid for by the rent, and so this wall heater is taken into consideration based on those factors coming together.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner Foster.
Thank you. Can you talk, just because it's come up in this case and it's not always typical, so I think it's worth talking about, the fact that they had to relocate because under the definition of a domicile, it has to have, LA County and state of California say it has to have a heater in order to be resided in. So in this case, I understand the tenant's frustration. I share their frustration with this dereliction of duty on behalf of the owner in this case, but the time out of the apartment was extended, due to the owner's choice of when they corrected, the condition. In our other types of cases, if it's fixing a screen door or replacing something else that's not required by the state, it's just a question of when did they correct it? The tenant gets to stay and have the quiet enjoyment of their space they contracted for. But in this case, the tenant's life was upended, for an extended period of time. So I feel like the tenant is frustrated and wishing that our finding could reflect their experience. And could you talk a little bit more about why we can't do that?
So, this is a little unconventional, but the tenants are here and they want to speak. So I'm going to stop everybody right now and let the tenants come up and speak. Will you please come up to the front?
Oh, I didn't realize there was.
Yeah, they're here.
Okay.
Do I have a timer on the board somewhere?
Yes.
The box, great. Good evening, board. Let me know when to start. Oh, okay, we're starting.
My apartment was without heat through the winter nights beginning late October through early March, a period of nearly 5 months. Every time the appliance was turned on, it would create carbon monoxide and leak gas, rendering it hazardous and unusable, as declared by SoCalGas twice. The temperatures dipped below 50 degrees every night, which was why Code Enforcement Officer Benson Reed declared the apartment uninhabitable. To make matters worse, after the hearing, the temporary replacement unit offered by my landlord had broken windows on the property, roaches, water damage, mold, and broken tile. The reason this was offered was so that my landlord would no longer have to continue supplying a per diem while the repairs were supposed to be completed. Her lawyer, Isaac Abba, attempted to intimidate and dissuade my partner and I from following through with the city rent control and building code officials. In the analysis conclusion of the decision, the hearing officer notes, while the wall heater was replaced the day before the hearing officer does not find that the repair was complete as of that date due to the past history of incomplete and frankly dangerous repairs made to the wall heater. And even though the owner eventually obtained the permit, the hearing officer finds it troublesome that despite the seriousness of the problems with the wall heater and the California and rent control law requiring adequate heating, the owner ignored Mr. Garibaldi's notice for 2 months, with further delays thereafter and during the ensuing winter months. The hearing officer has approved a decrease of $175 for 4 months, in total a one-time decrease of $700. My rent is $2,840 per month. The decrease approved is only 6% of what I pay to rent the unit per month, and at no point was I delinquent in paying my rent. 4 months of my rent is $11,360. I do not believe that this is a fair decrease when my family and I are only able to use it during normal business day hours, 8 a.m. to 6 p.m., before we have to vacate the premises. That's only 42% of the day that we would have access to our apartment. In the petition for rent decrease paperwork supplied by the City of Santa Monica under V Maintenance Related Conditions Regulation 4200 Delta, there is a dollar value range for inoperative or damaged heating system or air conditioning, and it is $15 to $220. The paperwork also states the hearing examiner or the board may grant a decrease that is greater or less than the amount shown based upon the evidence that is presented at the hearing, Regulations 4200 Echo and Hotel. Therefore, I am requesting the rent reduction match or come closer to matching the amount of time my apartment was usable as intended. A reduction of 58% per month comes to $1,647.20 per month. In total, over the 4-month period, the total would be $6,588.80. I mentioned I was curious as to how an inoperative heating system was calculated to warrant a range of $15 to $220 a month and what the baseline rent was calculated from. Also, what year was the baseline rent calculated from with the Mars, but that question was brought up earlier. To quote the hearing officer one more time in the decision, one of the central tenets of the rent control law is protecting tenants from paying excessive rent as a result of the landlord providing the tenant less than what was provided when the initial rent was established. I just want to add that it was red tagged for creating carbon monoxide. Then there was a 5-day period where we were moved back into our apartment. We had SoCalGas come check again. And then it was found that it was leaking gas a second time, as well as continuing to create carbon monoxide. It's been a frustrating experience, to be sure. And we have a 750 square foot apartment with one wall heater. So please take that into consideration. Do you have anything to add?
No, thank you.
Okay, and I think the last thing I want to add with the 45 seconds I have, our landlord, unfortunately, has had several run-ins with tenants and lost due to tenant harassment, and she's changed her name and her business ID. So when we rented the apartment, we did not know about her previous history, which may have altered our decision-making. But that is where we live, and this was our circumstance. Thank you.
Thank you. Does anyone have any questions?
Any questions? Okay.
I don't have any questions, so I think I'll wait and see if, I'll wait until someone asks. until we're done with questions.
You can go ahead, Commissioner. Commissioner Ambrose, you had other things that you wanted to state prior to?
Does anyone else have something, or then I'll go?
Yeah, we're going back into discussion.
Okay.
I just didn't want us to deliberate so long that they're waiting while we're deliberating.
Okay, so I certainly empathize with the tenant here. I think it's awful for someone to go without heat, especially during this time frame. You know, it's cold outside during those months, and I think that's awful. But the question here is whether we find the hearing officer's decision reasonable. And here, the officer did apply section 4200D and found 175 decrease, which is on the higher range, the range being, I think it was 15 or 18, to the max of 220. That's the allowable range. And they found the 175, which is on the higher end. That resulted at 6% of the tenant's rent. Even if the officer had applied the maximum amount at 220, that would have been a 7% portion of the rent. Therefore, I think that the officer's decision was reasonable. I can't say that it was an unreasonable decision. So that, I guess that's just my comment.
Vice Chair Gonska.
Yeah, I think I would agree with everything you just said. I think what we have to take a look at here is what the board's authority is and what we can do, and what we can do here tonight is to verify that and ensure that the hearing officer followed our regulations. And so there's a difference between what the rent control board and regulations can do to remedy this situation. That doesn't mean that it's the only thing that can be done, the only remedy the tenant has. It just means it's the only remedy within the board's purview that the tenant has. So, within the staff report here, it's noted that there may be potential options for the tenant to pursue in court regarding compensation for damages. That's outside of the purview of our regulations here. But I agree with my fellow commissioner here that it appears to me like the decreased amount that was granted is reasonable within our regulations. So I'm satisfied with that element of it. I'm not satisfied with the situation that the tenant finds themselves in and what they've gone through with this landlord. And I think that I would encourage them to think through other options, but in terms of what we can do here, I am satisfied. Thank you.
Commissioner Foster.
Thank you. I wanted staff to address something that sometimes we, over the years, see in the staff report, but I didn't see in this one. And sometimes there's a sentence in these that says, the hearing officer, looked at the history of this property or at the history of this landlord and either took note of prior actions or not. That is phrasing I've seen in the past that I haven't seen as much lately. And if someone in our city, maybe not this someone, if anyone in our city is a repeat offender, can you talk about whether, the hearing officer is allowed or when it's legally appropriate to take that into account? Because we're not seeing that mentioned, as I've noted, that we have in the past.
I think if you're looking at this case in particular, which is all we can look at tonight, the tenant can certainly file a tenant harassment suit. It sounds like there might be grounds for that. I was glad to see the code enforcement came in. They were offered a per diem, which is also under the city's code. So as Commissioner Gonska pointed out, there are probably other options available.
I'm sorry, but that wasn't thank you for that. That wasn't my question, though. In prior cases, I've seen it noted that the hearing officer, as part of what they do, either looks at past acts on a property or doesn't. And I understand what you said, like this is this case, but do you know the language I'm referring to?
I can address that. I think you're referring to when a hearing officer looks in the board records, and what we're trying to find out when we do that is if there are any decisions on record that relate to the specific issues in this case. We're not looking for bad prior acts. We're looking for things like, have amenity determinations already been made on this or other units, that can inform us what past decisions have gone on. So whether or not there's a lot of decreased cases or any other kind of cases or whatever was found, not terribly relevant to how we would approach a decrease, because again, that's not the criteria that the regulations allow us to use.
Thank you. That actually helps a lot. I appreciate you chiming in there because I always empathize with the parties to these cases, whether they have owned 20 buildings and done this a million times, or whether they're a tenant that's just going about their daily life and then all of a sudden has to become a legal expert. I can't tell you how many times we've talked to tenants in this city and had to say, educate yourself like your life depends on it. It's the roof over our heads, and it's part of the trade-off of having this body and this protection of rent control is that we have to, whether we like it or not, we have to really actively participate, and especially when you're faced with the basket of problems you've been faced with. I'm so sorry. I empathize. We are restrained so that we may continue to function as this body. We are restrained by the letter of the law. And so I hope we've done a decent job of explaining some of that tonight and even how we see it and interpret it, but the constraints that we're under. And there are plenty of other options I'm sure staff has discussed with you, as they would with any party that comes before us. So good luck. And thank you for the explanations from staff. Appreciate it.
All right. So given the facts before us, what is the motion?
I move that because the hearing officer's findings and decision are supported by substantial evidence and are in accordance with our regulations, that we affirm the hearing officer's decision and findings of fact and conclusions of law. I can.
Second that.
May we have a roll call vote, please?
Yes, Commissioner Ivanov,
Yes.
Commissioner Ambrose,
Yes.
Commissioner Foster,
Yes.
Vice Chair Gonska,
Yes.
Chair Leslie.
Yes.
Motion carries.
Now moving on to 10C.
Yes, Commissioners, this is a removal permit application. This property at 1537 Sentinel Avenue was developed as a 7-unit building back in 1969. And when the rent control law was adopted, the then owner had carved out a bootleg unit from Unit 1 on this property by closing off a hallway between the 2 bedrooms in the unit and calling that bootleg unit as number Unit 8 and then registering that unit with the Rent Control Board. Since then, the bootleg was recombined back into Unit 1 and rented to the current tenant as 1 unit since 2003, but the previous owner who did that didn't get a removal permit from the board to do so. And the current owner of the property, however, has applied for a removal permit for the registered bootleg unit that we have in our records, Unit 8. The board may grant this removal permit if the evidence shows that the unit isn't habitable and can't be made habitable in an economically feasible manner. The record shows that this bootleg unit was never habitable. As depicted in the plot plan that's in the staff report, this bootleg unit consisted of a 119 square foot bedroom and a makeshift 23 square foot kitchen that was carved out of that rump hallway that comprised of a fridge and a burner for cooking. The unit, therefore, failed to meet the minimum size standards for a habitable unit under the building code as detailed in the staff report. And because the unit couldn't be made habitable within its existing footprint, the board need not analyze whether it can be made habitable in an economically feasible manner. The unit therefore qualifies for a removal permit, and staff recommends the board grant the application and adopt the proposed findings of fact and conclusions of law.
Okay, we're opening up for discussion. Vice Chair Gonska.
So when we refer to Unit 8 being uninhabitable, you're referring to it being uninhabitable as its standalone unit, correct? Because it's currently being quote-unquote inhabited, but as part of, that same space as part of the Unit 1.
Essentially, they carved it out and then they put it back together, but they didn't bother telling us, and these people have, and they're trying to make things right.
So with this removal, it wouldn't be changing anything with the tenant who currently has Unit 1 that includes that space,
Right, it would
correct?
just be making everything legal.
Gotcha, okay. Thank you.
Commissioner Ambrose.
Yeah, so in this case, it seems very clear that there's no way to make this unit habitable. The square footage of both the livable space and also the kitchen space does not meet the requirements. So there's no way to expand the space. So, and the owner is under no obligation to build it out. Therefore, I think the facts are clear, and I guess I'll just go ahead and make the motion to grant the application for the removal permit at 1537 Sentinel Avenue pursuant to Charter Section 1803.
Second.
May we have a roll call vote?
Yes, Commissioner Ambrose,
Yes.
Commissioner Foster,
Yes.
Commissioner Ivanov,
Yes.
Vice Chair Gonska,
Yes.
Chair Leslie.
Yes.
Motion carries.
Now, moving on to our administrative item for 12A, Brian Augusta.
Good evening, Commissioners. That may be the final time that I get that kind of welcome, since this may be the last time I appear before you. Good evening, Chair and members. I'm Brian Augusta, your legislative advocate up in Sacramento. Very pleased to have an opportunity today to give you a recap of some of the things we have been following on your behalf in the state legislature and some of the important bills that were signed by the governor earlier this year. My presentation is maybe going to be a little bit briefer than usual for reasons I'll explain, but the short answer is despite 3,000 bills that got introduced at the beginning of session, narrowed down to about 2,000 that landed on the governor's desk, there's only a handful that are really of interest and relevant to the work of this board. But I wanted to also trace a little bit some of the themes from this year and talk briefly about what we might anticipate next year. So we are now at the conclusion of the 2-year session of the legislature, which convened in 2023. And as you know, we are headed into an election year, or we are in an election year. We're heading to an election. And there's a few themes from this year. One, we went from some close to record surplus in the state budget to significant deficit in a fairly short period of time. So we went from sort of dreaming big about how could we invest some of these public resources to really trying to hold on to what we have. And that impacts housing affordability as well, because in those years in which we had a surplus, we made significant investments in state housing programs. And this year, I think housing advocates of all stripes were very concerned that we were going to lose some of those investments, even possibly see some of them clawed back. As it turned out, we didn't lose any significant funding, and the governor and the legislature did agree to another $500 million increase in the state low-income housing tax credit program. So that does provide some investment, but really a lean year, and so a lot of the discussion was around what can we do that doesn't cost state money. As I had mentioned, it's an election year, and that always impacts sort of the mood and the approach in the Capitol, and we have a number of seasoned members who are leaving. But going back to the budget, or sort of fiscal issues, the legislature did put two bonds on the ballot, a climate bond and an education bond, each for $10 million that the voters will have a chance to vote on this year. But what we didn't see on the ballot, which I think was something that a lot of housing advocates had hoped to see, which is a affordable housing bond. Many of our state housing programs, although I mentioned a second ago that we've seen some infusion of general fund dollars, for the most part, rely on periodic approval from the voters of new bond allocation to fund those programs. For a variety of reasons, there was not support, seemingly from the governor and at least the Senate, to make the housing bond part of the bond conversation that led to both the climate bond and the school bond landing on the ballot. And so we aren't going to see new revenue through bonds this year, perhaps in 2 years. We will. The legislature did put Prop 5 on the ballot, which from a local perspective, it would lower the voter threshold for approving local bonds. So going from a 2/3 vote to 55% for housing and infrastructure. That's going to be a very close vote in the November ballot. So interesting to see how that turns out. Also on the ballot this year, not put on by the legislature, but obviously of note, is Prop 33, which once again will ask the voters to consider whether or not to repeal Costa-Hawkins. That measure has failed several times in the last few election cycles. This year, there's a provision in there that also is intended to say, if the voters were to enact this, landlord groups can't just come back to the legislature and reenact Costa-Hawkins by indicating that the legislature cannot regulate the enactment of local rent control policies, that is, how they're maintained or enacted or expanded. That provision is being used by opponents of Prop 33 to argue that it will actually repeal a whole host of unrelated state housing laws. And as we saw in prior election cycles, that sort of messaging is very confusing for voters, because it's very rare for voters to be asked to sort of repeal something, right? And most of these this is just a strict repeal. It's not creating anything other than an opportunity for local governments to restore their authority to regulate rents in ways that Costa-Hawkins prevents them from doing. So it will be, I'm not going to make any predictions, you all can if you like, but it will be a very interesting thing to see how Prop 33 turns out this time around, or this effort to repeal Costa-Hawkins. But I will say that continues to be a subject of conversation among advocates in Sacramento. And undoubtedly, the question of whether some or all of Costa-Hawkins should be amended or repealed or revisited is going to be part of the conversation, especially as we continue to see more and more cities enacting some form of local rent regulation and just cause. So that's sort of the big picture, the mood in the Capitol, the mood in the state on housing. I just want to highlight 3 bills of note. The first, probably the only bill that directly relates to rent stabilization, was AB 846. As you probably know, the Tenant Protection Act, which covers many units that are not covered by your rent stabilization ordinance, and provides an anti-gouging protection of CPI plus 5% or a maximum of 10%, right? That law exempts deed restricted housing, including the primary form of newly constructed deed restricted housing, which are those that are funded by the federal low-income housing tax credit program. So those units are excluded from the TPA. Earlier in the year, the body that regulates tax credits, the Tax Credit Allocation Committee, adopted a regulation to say, for newly constructed units that are funded through this program, we're going to impose a rent cap similar to the TPA, with the same percentages that I just described. but they didn't feel they had the authority to regulate existing units. This bill, AB 846 by Assemblymember Bonta, directs them to adopt a regulation that would provide rent limitations on existing units. It doesn't specify what that regulation should look like, and it gives them the authority to revisit it. It's anticipated by many that it will look a lot like the regulation that they previously adopted, so it'll sort of track the TPA. But that was signed, and they have until next year to enact a regulation to implement it. Also of note is AB 2347 by Assemblymember Colra. As you all know very well, one significant factor in housing stability or instability for renters is the very short timeline that a tenant has to respond to an eviction action. So even if there is a meritorious defense or dispute, a tenant only has 5 days to respond, in most cases, 5 days to respond if they're personally served with the eviction action. And it has been long discussed that that time period, which is very short compared to other civil actions where it's 30 days, should be longer. This bill doubles it. So it's now going to be 10 days for in-person service, which gives tenants more time to seek advice, marshal their defenses, get to the courthouse, file the right paperwork, and have their day in court. It's, I think, noteworthy that the California, the California Apartment Association, who obviously weighs in Sacramento on all of these bills, eventually was neutral on that bill, in part because there was a provision that also struck a compromise around what if the tenant files something like a demur or a motion to strike, which are other motions that a tenant could file instead of the answer that attack sort of the pleadings by the landlord. And those don't have a clear timeline. And so in some jurisdictions, that could end up being a very long timeline. In many jurisdictions, it's not very long, but in some it's longer. And so this bill establishes some clearer timelines that make it more uniform and fit into the unlawful detainer process. So that was sort of the trade-off that got the Apartment Association neutral on that. Other groups were still opposed, but the governor signed it. So that becomes effective January 1, and I think it's important, just noting here, as I know the staff of this body will do, but there's a lot of materials that refer to a shorter timeline that we're all gonna have to focus on making sure we update and get out that information out to tenants and landlords alike. Lastly, I just want to mention sort of different flavor, but one barrier that tenants face in seeking housing in our tight rental housing markets is that everywhere they go, almost everywhere, they're charged just an application screening fee. And for many tenants, it doesn't turn out well because they're either, there are way more applicants than there are units available, or they don't pass the screening, but they still end up paying that fee. So Assemblymember Pellerin's bill attempts to address that by basically ensuring that only a successful tenant is likely to pay the fee. And it does so by either saying that any applicant who pays the fee and isn't selected gets a refund of their application fee, or the landlord can have a process by which they just take everyone in the order that they applied. They run the fee. If they don't pass the screening, then they don't get the feedback because they ran the screening. But if that person gets selected, everyone down the line doesn't have to pay the fee. So hopefully a useful improvement for folks who are paying multiple fees at every property to try to find a unit that they can, where they pass the screening. And then just finally, next year, a little early to predict what we're going to see, but we're going to have a budget deficit, continuing budget deficit. So it will be another sort of conversation that steers away from programs and proposals that cost new money. But we will also see a fairly new legislature. I think there's something like 23 members of the Assembly are departing. We'll have new faces in the Assembly and some new faces in the Senate. Some folks are moving from Assembly to Senate, but significant turnover, which is for everyone doing work in Sacramento, a challenge, but I think for housing advocates and proponents and supporters of rent control, it's a whole new crop of elected officials with whom we need to spend some time talking about the issues that we care about. So that's going to be a factor. It always is when we have that high level of turnover in how quickly the body sort of moves new proposals. It also means we often see a lot of proposals that probably aren't going anywhere early in the session. Will be an interesting first half of that new legislative session when they convene in December. So I'll stop there. If there are questions or comments on any of what I presented or questions about things I didn't talk about, happy to answer those.
Commissioner Foster.
Thank you. Of course I have questions. Hi, Ryan.
Hello.
So I don't know if you were here earlier.
Yes.
Eviction masking, which, thank God, California has a law like that. Any appetite anywhere for a database of landlords who repeatedly get sued by their tenants or who have repeated violations of building codes or safety codes or code violations?
Yeah. I did hear that discussion earlier.
I had to ask.
Yeah. Well, will you want a response on that? I mean, I think there have been bills now, several years in a row, trying to provide some database about evictions and other data around landlords. It's a real challenge because it's hard to know who each landlord is and whether that building and that held by that LLC is the same landlord that holds this building in an LLC. So I'll just note that there was a bill this year to try to create more transparency there that.
Right, unmasking LLCs.
Yes, exactly.
We might get there someday.
Yes.
Thank you. Jimmy Gomez in our Congress has not only a dad's caucus, but a renters caucus now for the federal government. Might we use that maybe to sort of identify people who might be more friendly to conversations?
I think that's a good idea. And I think in California, we have a renters caucus that's made up of just a handful of members who identify as renters. That is, they themselves are renters, and it's a very small number, which is also probably an indicator of how some of these issues land when we go and talk to legislators. So obviously, interesting conversation about whether that caucus could grow in the years to come.
I love 2347, the UD answer period. Until we have a more robust or even existent right to counsel program up and down the state, what we don't want to see are any more Christmas surprises. In the good old days, 3-day notices would be served around the holidays when courts were closed or when tenants were traveling or likely to not be at home. And so, going from 3 to 5 to 10, I mean, these are things that will change people's lives and prevent homelessness, and so we really appreciate that one. And then the basket of bills, I've used the basket like 6 times tonight. I do realize that. I recognize that. Lots of things, lots of words. Pellerin, Friedman, and Bradford, whether it's the application fees, the security deposits, rent reporting for credit records. I cannot tell you how many everyday Americans and everyday Californians can be affected very greatly by $100, $200. The average American family cannot put their hands on $400 cash. A few years ago, it was $5. Now it's $400 cash. Most are underwater or living on credit in cycles of credit. And so things like $50, several hundreds of dollars in the return of a security deposit without I'm sure some of them are good people. Some of the downright fraud that goes on with returning security deposits, these bills will change lives and will really, really help everyday people. So we're glad to see those. And finally, 2926, the preservation notice law changes. Yeah. It pains me and shocks me that it's city by city. you know what I'm about to say. Covenants that expire on our deed restricted affordable housing. There's a constituent here who contacted me a couple of months ago. It's ongoing, but the building her mother lives in, which is technically rent, we have a lot of overlap. Some are rent controlled, some are not. Some individual units within an affordable building are rent controlled and some are not. And there's all of these different formulas and rent levels that things can go up and down to. And in this case, it's a deed restricted senior building. And the nonprofit operating it is running out of steam, and it's just going to sell it to a for-profit person, and there's nothing anybody can do about it because the covenant's expiring at the same time. The fact that 55 years, we're all living a lot longer than we used to, and 55 years is not enough. 99 years is not enough. And I would love to see advocacy from your firm on behalf of us or from legislators who are friendly to it. Carry legislation or entertain it at least that gets rid of these godforsaken 55-year covenants because they expire, in a generation. I mean, it's not enough, and it leaves people scrambling for affordable housing that we don't have. They're in a building that's already naturally occurring affordable and was funded with public dollars. I don't know why we let those convert to private and market rate. So thank you for almost 9 great years of working together.
Yes.
I hope that we will find other venues and avenues within which to work together and continue the fight. I've loved our time together.
Commissioner Foster, I just want to commend you for your just immense dedication to the people of Santa Monica and renters and rent stabilization policy in particular. Your service on this board has changed the complexion of the work that we do. You've been an amazing leader, but I also appreciate your friendship and always your warm welcome when I come. Somebody else is going to have to, Danny, I'm picking you to thank you.
Start clapping.
So I'm really sorry to see you go, but I really hope we continue to work together in the future.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Brian.
Hi, Brian, just one question.
You got to do better than that. Hi, Brian. No. Oh, not yet?
Next time.
Not next time, okay.
That
That was my joke.
So for Pellerin's.
Your mic.
Yeah.
Does the bill have any language in there about any sort of enforcement mechanism? Be a matter of basically, the applicant would have to go to small claims court to get their money.
Yeah, I think it's going to rely on private enforcement, maybe using unfair business practices or other. There's not a express cause of action. Yeah.
Because I would hope, I don't know if there's a way for, letters or make some sort of announcement. I don't think the general public is going to know or be informed about, this is a relatively, niche issue in the application process. So to the extent that we can find a way to communicate that to our tenants, I think that would be a good idea.
Yeah, great.
Okay, now I have a question. Hello, Brian.
Hello.
So I have a question about SB 1051 Eggman.
Yeah.
What proof would be required for the domestic violence victims?
Yeah, so that's an important change that it makes is that, previously it would require a police report. So now, and I'm not going to be able to recite the entire list, but a social worker, other entities who are involved in assisting victims of domestic violence can also substantiate the claim. So that's one of the things. It also expands the protections to not just the head of household or the tenant, but other family members are also protected.
Okay. So, and here's another question as well. As you said, there's other family members in there. So when the locks are changed, would that have to be substantiated prior to the locks being changed, or can it be substantiated afterwards?
Well, so what the law provides is that if the tenant provides this evidence to the landlord and asks for the locks to change, and they don't do it, then the tenant can make the change, and then the landlord is obligated to reimburse the tenant for the cost of making the lock change. But I think the way in which the law is structured, it has to start with providing the evidence to the landlord to substantiate it. Of course, if they dispute that, that's a different question. The tenant could move forward and use their evidence in a subsequent enforcement action to recover the cost of doing that.
So if the landlord disputes it, is that something that needs to be taken to court, or how would they?
Yeah, potentially, yeah. Because they're going to change the lock to protect themselves and seek reimbursement from the landlord. If the landlord refuses to provide the reimbursement, then there's going to end up being some dispute whether they attempt to deduct it from the rent or seek in small claims court or through some other mechanism. That's the recourse.
Okay. I'm just very happy and excited about the Freedmen security deposits and the rent reporting. For a lot of low-income families, that is a game changer. The reporting of rent to help with their credit. Because that's one of the things that prevents them from obtaining new housing unit, affordable units. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Any other questions? Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Appreciate it.
So now we're going to adjourn. And in true fashion, this month, I'm adjourning in honor of Breast Cancer Month, as I lost my mother to breast cancer, and also in honor of Alvin Ho, our board secretary. We will miss you a lot. Thank you for everything that you've done for us. We must applaud you, and we wish you the best in your next job position. Thank you. Our next board meeting is November 14th. Thank you so much. We are adjourned.